In today's shipwreck video, we'll be returning to the Pacific Ocean and to Japanese shipwrecks. In this case, a deep-water submarine. I-201, the most advanced submarine built by the Japanese in the 1940s. This boat was designed with one thing in mind, and that was underwater speed, coming out to around 19 knots when submerged. For the 1940s, this was very fast, faster even than the 15 knots surface speed, theoretically a very capable design. Unfortunately for the Japanese, development took too long. I-201 would never see combat. Ultimately, she would be captured in port by the United States, and after extensive study, sunk off the coast of Hawaii, where the wreck was eventually discovered in pieces decades later. Let's briefly touch on how she got there, and then look at the wreck itself. I-201 was launched on February 2nd, 1945. By this point, the Japanese fleet was a shadow of its former self. Only one major action remained in Operation 10 Go. Of course, as a submarine, I-201 was not assigned to that operation. Instead, she spent her entire time in service on testing duty, with the submarine based in Maizuru on August 15, 1945, when the Japanese surrendered and the war came to its end, even if the formal surrender ceremony didn't come until September 2nd. At this point, I-201 was seized along with other Japanese submarines. The Americans had a particular interest, as you could expect, in the fancy new boats. Submarines like I-201 or the big carrier submarines, such as I-14 of the Type AM design, and the I-400s even larger than that. All of these boats would be put through extensive testing over the following year. In I-201's case, she would have a rough time. First, a battery fire on December 11th, 1945, and then an engine failure on January 26th, 1946. Nonetheless, the boat would eventually make it, albeit under tow, to Hawaii on February 13th. She would not be there long. On March 23rd, 1946, I-201 was expended as a target, sunk by a torpedo from USS Queenfish. There's actually footage of that sinking, which I'll link in the description. Her wreck was largely forgotten at that point, a victim of early Cold War tensions as the United States destroyed all advanced Japanese submarines to keep any knowledge of their capabilities and design out of Soviet hands. It wouldn't be until 2009, fairly recently, that the wreck was located. The Hawaii Undersea Research Laboratory found I-201 on February 16th of 2009 during a search operation that also located I-14. Both submarines are at a depth of around 800 meters or 2,625 feet. I-201 was found in two pieces. The bow broke off during the sinking, falling well away from the main hull. You can almost make that out in the footage of the sinking. Despite that, the boat was remarkably well preserved when she was located. The submarine's designation and a Japanese flag and chrysanthemum were still visible on the conning tower. The flag in particular as bright as the day it was painted. In addition to that, the submarine's deck still retained much of its wood. We'll be looking at that in this video, of course. However, before that, one final note. Last year, as of this recording, Nautilus returned to the wreck. Despite being 14 years later, not much has changed. The most notable difference was some marine growth on the conning tower and fading of the paint. With that note done, let's move on. This will be a mix of the original footage and the Nautilus survey. I'll also link the video they took in the description. As for the wreck, we'll start with the most distinctive part, that being the conning tower. This was very streamlined as part of the effort for greater speed, something that remains apparent even after decades underwater. The tower narrows a lot towards the front, and even when it widens out, it's not by much. While we're at the front, there's also some interesting details. The windows being the main one. That's not a common thing on submarines from this time period, and it makes the conning tower look almost like a Soviet submarine. As for the general condition, well, it could be worse. 800 meters is not shallow, but it is on the shallower end for a deep-water Pacific wreck. In spite of that, there's not as much deterioration as you might expect. It's rusted, certainly, but some of the paint is still there, and the marine growth isn't terrible. And of course, the windows are intact. Now, the tower doesn't look as good from above. The rusting is worse, and it's covered in strands, what look like fishing lines. There's not a lot of detail to make out, but you can see the periscope here, along with holes in the top. Those are structural features, but I can't say for sure what purpose they served. We can see them better here. Not perfectly, but better. So let's move on to the side of the conning tower. First, we have an older image from the first survey. This shows far less fishing lines and a less overgrown structure. The imperial chrysanthemum is also visible. The white paint has started to yellow a bit, but not to the point of being unrecognizable. Unfortunately, the picture doesn't show much else, other than a cleaner periscope and a bit of the lower part of the conning tower, which we can see much better here. It's still not the best picture of the bunch, but it's a useful comparison for later. Here we have a nice side shot showing three things of note. First, an open entrance into the tower, with an intact ladder beneath it. Second, we have the I-201 paint, clear as day. It hasn't faded much and is completely legible. And third, we have the Japanese flag. This has been covered up a little, although still not by much. It's in worse shape than the name, but probably about the same as the chrysanthemum. The rest of the conning tower, meanwhile, matches with the other pictures. Very little marine life, and generally in decent shape. That remains the same when looking from a lower angle. There's not much to add other than a better look at the ladder and the flag, both of which are important when we move on to Nautilus. Now, as we look at this, remember that 14 years passed between the surveys. There's definitely signs of the aging here. The paint on the I-201 is in rougher shape. There are very notable splotches where it's being covered up, slowly but surely. The same goes for the crest on the upper portion of the conning tower, as well as the flag, which has definitely fared the worst here. It's heavily faded, with the red starting to wash out, especially on the sun rays. Moreover, the white paint has started to yellow, and this isn't even touching on the marine life growing on it. I'd say the flag is probably the best demonstration of the time gap, with the general increase in rust, including the worst condition of the ladder, coming in second. This look from further out gives the best look at the full conning tower, showing the streamlined shape once again. However, that wraps things up here. The next area is the hull. Most of this is going to come from Nautilus, starting here with the stern. This shows a couple things of note. First, much more marine life. It's growing on the dive plane and the prop. That dive plane is actually an interesting design choice. At the time, it was far more common to be on the bow. It's also angled slightly, likely pushed up by water pressure as the boat sank. If you watch the sinking footage, I-201 went down very quickly, so that wouldn't surprise me. I'm also not surprised to see the rudder on the center line. The boat was empty and a target, so it only makes sense to keep her straight and level. More interesting, I think, is the overall condition. The stern doesn't show major damage, and the prop shaft is firmly in place. Actually, both of them are. We can see both props in this image from the original survey. It's poor quality, however, so there's not much else to say. That said, a bit further along the boat, there is some damage to the stern, a split in the side here. This was definitely a result of the sinking, although it's not clear if it's from impact with the bottom or from something else. The same goes for a hole in the pressure hull directly beneath the conning tower. This is a pretty large gash in the side that you can see here from a distance, and much better here from closer in. There's scattered debris inside, and you can also see the rough texture of the hull. This is not torpedo damage, or at least not direct damage. The sinking footage shows the impact was further ahead of the tower, and this hole is too small to be from a direct hit. If I had to guess, the torpedo hit roughly where the bow broke, which we can see here. It's actually a remarkably clean split considering the damage I-201 suffered, especially when you look at the sinking frame by frame. Actually, I'll put up what I mean here, and this image is before the bow dropped away or the worst of the explosion. Regardless, the hulk on the bottom isn't terrible. There is bent and broken metal towards the top and the bottom, but the overall condition is still decent. You can see inside the hull, and the shape of the submarine is still recognizable. That's even more apparent here. According to the Nautilus video, this is roughly where the battery compartment would have been. If so, you can't actually see any of the batteries, just more twisted metal. The boat looks much worse here. She's still recognizable, but the damage is worse. When you look at it from above, it doesn't get prettier. The hull is split and torn, with much of the deck gone, to the point you can't really make out details, beyond the shape of the inner hull here. That mostly rounds things off here, but I'll share one more picture of this section. This one from further out. This shows the overall shape and condition of the hull, from the tower to the side, including some damage. Now for the only picture of the bow, which is a shot from directly ahead, showing the sharp angle. But not much else. The bow is clearly laying on its side, and the overall preservation matches with the rest of the boat. Everything beyond that is in the dark. So let's move to the deck. There's not much to cover here, but what is there is interesting. First off, because of the preservation of the wood. As you can see here, while it's certainly rotting away, much of it is still there, right down to the individual planks. More fascinating is the 25mm gun here. This is from the original survey. I-201 did not carry a traditional deck gun. Instead, the boat only carried two 25mm anti-aircraft guns. These were carried in retractable mountings to further streamline the hull, and you can see that here, with the shape of the deck around the gun, something easier to see on the Nautilus footage. Here we have where the barrel would go, with the larger square for the mount itself. As for the deck, the wood has rotted a bit more, but for the most part, there's not that much difference. Which brings us to the last two pictures. First, this one. Nautilus found a torpedo nearby. To me, this looks like a Mark 27, or as submarine crews called it, a cutie. For comparison, we have a museum piece here. And now the final image. A pretty ghostly shot of the submarine from up close. We can see the damage to the side, and the marine growth, along with the conning tower poking out of the darkness. It seemed a fitting image to end on. Thank you for watching. Remember to like, comment, and subscribe if you enjoy the content. And I'll see you in the next one.